The duffel bag slipped from my shoulder as I stepped onto the deck of the Mercy's Call, and I had to grab the railing to keep from stumbling. The boat rocked beneath my feet in a way that made my stomach lurch, even though we were still tied to the dock. I'd never been on anything bigger than a rowboat before, but I needed this job. The cannery work had dried up 3 weeks ago, and my landlord wasn't interested in hearing about the local economy. I straightened up and looked around at the fishing vessel that would be my home for the next month. Everything was bigger than I'd expected. The winches, the nets, the crane that stretched up toward the overcast sky. The smell hit me next. Salt, diesel fuel, and something else I couldn't identify, but that made me think of deep, cold places. "You Mitchell?" I turned to see a man walking toward me across the deck. He had to be Captain Sullivan. Weather-beaten face, gray beard, and the kind of steady walk that said he'd been doing this for decades. His eyes took me in with the same careful attention I'd seen my father give to used car engines. "Yes, sir. Thomas Mitchell." He nodded once. "Harold Sullivan. Welcome aboard." The captain shook my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts, then gestured for me to follow him toward the cabin structure. My duffel bag felt heavier as I hauled it over my shoulder and tried to match his pace across the swaying deck. "First time on a deep-sea vessel?" Harold asked. "Yes, sir." "Thought so. You've got that look." He glanced back at me. "How much do you know about the work?" "I can handle nets. I've cleaned fish before, and I'm not afraid of hard work." Harold stopped walking and turned to face me fully. His expression had changed. Still serious, but now there was something else there. Something that made me want to take a step back. "That's good, but there are other things you need to know. Things that aren't in any manual or job description." I waited, not sure what he meant. "3 rules," Harold said, "and I need you to understand that these aren't suggestions. They're not safety regulations or company policy. They're the difference between coming home and not coming home." The way he said it made my skin prickle. I'd expected lectures about life jackets and emergency procedures, not whatever this was turning into. First rule, never go out on deck alone at night. Ever. I don't care if you hear someone calling for help. I don't care if you see equipment that needs securing. I don't care if the boat's on fire. You wake someone up first. Harold's eyes never left mine as he spoke. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why being alone on deck would be more dangerous than being alone anywhere else on a boat. Second rule, if someone knocks on your cabin door, you don't answer it. You ask who it is through the door. If they don't answer, or if something feels wrong about their response, you leave the door locked. This one made even less sense. I opened my mouth to ask why, but Harold held up a hand. Third rule, never look overboard. Not at night, not during the day, not ever unless it's part of your assigned duties and someone else is with you. I couldn't help it. I laughed. It came out before I could stop it. A nervous sound that seemed too loud on the empty deck. Harold's expression didn't change at all. "I'm sorry, Captain, but are you serious? Those sound like..." "Like what?" The words died in my throat. Harold wasn't smiling, wasn't giving me any indication that this was some kind of hazing ritual for new crew members. His face had the same gravity I'd seen on my grandfather's when he talked about the war. "Like superstitions," I finished quietly. "You think that's what they are?" I shrugged, suddenly feeling very young. "I mean, what else would they be?" Harold looked at me for a long moment, then nodded toward the cabin. "Come on, let me show you where you'll be bunking." He led me through a narrow door into a cramped corridor lined with metal walls. The smell of diesel was stronger here, mixed with coffee and the lingering scent of fried food. Harold pointed to a door marked with the number 3. "You'll be sharing with Charlie Brooks. He's been with us for 4 years, knows the ropes. He'll help you get settled." I dropped my bag next to one of the narrow bunks and looked around the small cabin. 2 beds, a tiny desk, and barely enough room for 2 people to stand without bumping into each other. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping in my car. "Dinner's at 6, Harold said from the doorway. "We pull out with the tide at 11 tonight." He paused. "And Mitchell, I meant what I said about those rules. Every word." The door closed behind him with a solid click, leaving me alone in the cabin. I sat down on the edge of what I assumed was my bunk and tried to make sense of the conversation. Harold had seemed completely serious, but the rules themselves were absurd. What could possibly happen from looking over the side of a boat? The next few hours passed in a blur of introductions, equipment explanations, and trying to remember where everything was supposed to go. Charlie Brooks turned out to be a quiet guy with steady hands and a way of moving around the boat like he'd been born on deck. He showed me how to secure the nets properly and which controls operated which winch, but when I asked him about Harold's 3 rules, he just nodded and said I should listen to the captain. "He knows what he's talking about," Charlie said, and wouldn't elaborate. By evening, we were hours out from shore, and the coastline had disappeared into a gray line on the horizon. The boat moved differently now, rising and falling with swells that seemed to come from every direction. I'd managed to keep my dinner down, which I counted as a victory, but my legs still felt unsteady as I made my way around the deck. Most of the crew had turned in for the night, since we'd be starting work before dawn. I should have gone to bed too, but I was too wired to sleep. The combination of nervousness and excitement kept me moving, checking equipment I'd already checked and trying to memorize the layout of every rope and hook. I found myself near the stern where the deck sloped down toward the water. The ocean stretched out in all directions, dark and endless under the cloudy sky. I'd never seen so much water in my life. It made me feel small in a way that was both terrifying and oddly peaceful. That's when I remembered Harold's 3rd rule: never look overboard. Standing there next to the railing, the rule seemed even more ridiculous than it had that afternoon. What was I supposed to do? Walk around with my eyes closed? The ocean was right there, just a few feet away. Looking at it was as natural as breathing. I glanced around the deck. No one else was visible. They were all below, getting ready for bed or already asleep. The only sounds were the engine's steady rumble and the splash of water against the hull. It would just be a quick look, just to see what the water looked like at night from a boat this size. I stepped closer to the railing and gripped the metal bar with both hands. The boat rose on a swell, giving me a better view down into the dark water. At first, I saw exactly what I'd expected. Black ocean, white foam where the boat's wake cut through the waves, maybe a reflection of the boat's lights on the surface. Then I saw my face. It was staring back at me from the water, perfectly clear and detailed, even though the surface should have been too choppy for any kind of reflection. The face in the water looked exactly like mine. Same nose, same dark hair, same nervous expression I'd probably been wearing all day, but it wasn't moving the way a reflection should move. I raised my hand to touch my cheek, and the face in the water didn't copy the motion. Instead, it smiled. A slow, knowing smile that I definitely wasn't making. Then it opened its mouth and began speaking, though I couldn't hear any words over the boat's engine and the splash of waves. I leaned closer, trying to understand what it was saying, and the face in the water leaned closer too, as if it was just as curious about me as I was about it. The smile never wavered. If anything, it grew wider. Terror hit me like ice water in my veins. I stumbled backward from the railing so fast that I tripped over a coiled rope and went down hard on the deck. My elbow cracked against the metal surface, sending a spike of pain up my arm, but I barely noticed. I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin area, my heart hammering against my ribs and my breath coming in short gasps. Several crew members were still in the galley, playing cards and drinking coffee. They looked up when I burst through the door, probably wondering why I looked like I'd seen a ghost. "You okay?" one of them asked. "The water," I managed. "There's something in the water." Charlie set down his cards and stood up. What kind of something? I was looking over the railing and there was... I trailed off, realizing how insane I was about to sound. But Charlie was already moving toward the door, followed by 2 other crew members. They didn't seem surprised or skeptical, just alert like they'd been expecting something like this. We went back to the stern together, the 3 of them carrying flashlights and moving with the kind of careful attention that made me think they'd done this before. I pointed to the exact spot where I'd been standing, and they aimed their lights down into the water. Nothing. Just dark ocean in the boat's wake. I saw my face, I said quietly. It was looking back at me, but it wasn't a reflection. It was smiling, and it was trying to say something. The crew members exchanged glances, but didn't laugh or tell me I'd been seeing things. They spent several more minutes checking the water with their flashlights before Charlie finally nodded toward the cabin. Let's go back inside. I followed them, feeling like an idiot, but also more scared than I wanted to admit. Whatever I'd seen down there, it hadn't been natural. And the way the crew had reacted, serious, careful, but not surprised, made me think I wasn't the first person to see something like it. We were almost back to the galley when Harold appeared in the corridor. He took one look at my face and asked what had happened. When I explained, his expression went through the same changes I'd seen that afternoon. Stern attention, followed by something that looked almost like fear. "You looked overboard," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you saw yourself looking back?" I nodded. Harold was quiet for a long moment, studying me with those sharp eyes. Finally, he shook his head. "You got lucky, Mitchell. Some crew members who look overboard never come back up from the water." 2 days of fishing had passed since my encounter at the stern railing, and I'd managed to convince myself that what I saw in the water might have been some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and nerves. The work helped keep my mind occupied, hauling nets, sorting fish, learning the rhythm of the boat's daily routine. Charlie had been patient with my mistakes, showing me how to tie the proper knots and which fish went into which hold without making me feel stupid about not knowing. I was getting better at moving around the deck too, finding my sea legs as the older crew members called it. The constant motion of the boat no longer made my stomach turn, and I could walk across the deck without grabbing for handholds every few steps. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that surprised me. There was something about being part of a crew, everyone working together toward the same goal, that made the long hours and aching muscles feel worthwhile. But Harold's rules still nagged at me. Every time I passed the stern railing, I found myself thinking about that face in the water and the way it had smiled at me. The memory felt less real now, more like something I might have dreamed, but I couldn't shake the certainty that it had actually happened. The other crew members treated me normally, no different than before, but I caught Charlie watching me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking. The evening routine had become familiar. Dinner in the galley, a few hands of cards or quiet conversation, then back to our bunks to rest up for the next day's work. I was getting used to the cramped cabin Charlie and I shared, the way the boat's movements translated into creaks and groans in the metal walls, the steady thrum of the engine that had become a kind of lullaby. I'd changed into my sleeping clothes and was settling onto my narrow bunk when 3 sharp knocks echoed from our cabin door. The sound was precise, deliberate, evenly spaced, not the casual rap of someone checking in or the urgent pounding of an emergency. Just 3 clean knocks that seemed to hang in the air after they finished. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk and stood up, automatically moving toward the door. Someone probably needed help with something, or maybe Harold wanted to talk about tomorrow's work plan. It was still early enough that crew members might be moving around the boat. Charlie's hand clamped down on my arm before I'd taken 2 steps. He shook his head firmly, his eyes fixed on the door. His grip was strong enough that I couldn't have pulled away even if I'd wanted to. There was something in his expression that made me freeze, not just caution, but genuine fear. "Everyone's in the galley," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Playing cards. All of them." I stared at him, not understanding. If everyone was in the galley, then who had knocked? Maybe someone had left the card game early, or maybe Harold was making his rounds to check on the crew. There had to be a simple explanation. The knocking came again. 3 more sharp raps, identical to the first set. Patient, but insistent. Charlie's grip on my arm tightened. He was still watching the door like it might burst open at any moment. His breathing had changed, becoming shallow and controlled, the way someone breathes when they're trying to stay very quiet. Then came the voice. "Thomas." I felt my knees go weak. The voice was muffled by the metal door, but I would have recognized it anywhere. It was Sarah's voice, my sister Sarah, who lived 3 states away and had never set foot on a boat in her life. "Thomas, please. I'm lost, and I don't know where I am. I'm scared." My hand moved toward the door handle without any conscious decision on my part. Sarah sounded terrified, confused, like she was crying. She was my little sister, and she needed help, and I was just standing there doing nothing. Charlie yanked me backward so hard that I stumbled and nearly fell. He clamped his other hand over my mouth before I could say anything, his eyes wide with panic. He pressed his face close to mine and mouthed a single word. "No." "Thomas, why won't you answer me?" Sarah's voice continued from the other side of the door. "I can hear you in there. Please, I'm so scared. I don't know how I got here." The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every slight tremor that Sarah got when she was upset, even the way she pronounced my name with just a hint of the accent we'd both inherited from our mother. If I hadn't known for certain that Sarah was hundreds of miles away, working her shift at the diner in Millbrook, I would have sworn she was standing right outside our cabin. "Thomas, please, there are things moving around out here. I can hear them, but I can't see them. I need you to let me in." I struggled against Charlie's grip, but he held on tight. Sarah was out there alone, surrounded by whatever dangers lurked on this boat at night, and I was trapped in this cabin by my bunkmate who seemed to think helping my sister was somehow the wrong thing to do. The knocking started again, but now it was different, faster, more desperate, like someone pounding with both fists instead of using their knuckles. The metal door rattled in its frame with each impact. Thomas, please, they're getting closer. I can hear them breathing." Sarah's voice had risen to nearly a scream, raw with terror. Every instinct I had told me to throw off Charlie's hands and open that door. My sister needed me, and I was failing her the same way I'd failed at everything else in my life. But Charlie wouldn't let go. His hand stayed clamped over my mouth, and his eyes never left mine. He was trying to tell me something without words, something urgent and important that I couldn't understand. The pounding on the door reached a crescendo, so violent that I was sure the metal would buckle. Sarah's screams filled the small cabin, echoing off the walls until it felt like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. Then, suddenly, silence. The pounding stopped. Sarah's voice cut off mid-scream. The only sounds left were the engine's steady rumble and the splash of water against the hull. Charlie held us both motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, slowly, he removed his hand from my mouth and loosened his grip on my arm. I could see sweat beading on his forehead, even though the cabin wasn't particularly warm. "That wasn't your sister," he said quietly. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died before I could speak them. Now that the voice was gone, I could think more clearly. Sarah was in Millbrook. She was at work, or at home watching television, or asleep in her own bed. She had never been on this boat and had no way of getting here. How did it know her name? I asked. How did it know how she sounds? Charlie sat down heavily on his bunk and ran his hands through his hair. He looked exhausted, like the last few minutes had drained something out of him. "They always know," he said. "Personal details, voices, things you've never told anyone. They're good at getting inside your head, finding the people you care about most. They? Whatever's out there. In the water, on the deck, in the spaces between the walls." Charlie looked up at me. "I've seen it happen before. Two guys, experienced fishermen who'd been working boats for 20 years. Both of them heard voices calling them. One heard his dead father, the other heard his kid who'd been sick. They opened their doors." I waited for him to continue. "We found their cabins empty the next morning, doors standing wide open, beds still warm. Never saw either of them again." The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in closer. I thought about Sarah's voice, how perfect it had been, how desperately I'd wanted to help her. If Charlie hadn't stopped me, I would have opened that door without hesitation. "Harold's rules," I said. Charlie nodded. "If someone knocks on your cabin door, you don't answer it. You ask who it is through the door. If they don't answer, or if something feels wrong about their response, you leave the door locked." I remembered Harold's exact words from my first day on the boat. At the time, they'd seemed like paranoid nonsense. Now they felt like the only thing standing between me and whatever had been pretending to be my sister. "How long has this been happening?" "As long as people have been fishing these waters," Charlie said. "Probably longer. The old-timers used to tell stories about ghost ships and sea witches, but they knew what they were really talking about. Most people just called it superstition and ignored the warnings. Until something took them. Yeah, until something took them." I sat down on my own bunk, my legs still shaky from the adrenaline. The cabin felt different now, less like a cramped but safe shelter and more like a thin barrier, holding back something that wanted to get in. I found myself studying the door, wondering how strong it really was, whether the lock would hold if something really wanted to break through. "The voice was so real," I said. "If you hadn't stopped me." "But I did stop you. That's how it works out here. We look out for each other, keep each other from making mistakes." Charlie leaned back against the wall. "Harold paired us up on purpose. He knows the new guys are the most vulnerable." I thought about my first night on the boat, standing at the stern railing and looking down into the water. Charlie had been asleep then, and I'd broken Harold's rules on my own. If something had wanted to take me that night, there would have been no one to stop it. "This thing, whatever it is, it's hunting us." "Not hunting," Charlie said. "Testing, looking for weakness, for someone who will break the rules. It's patient. It can wait as long as it needs to." The idea that something was actively studying us, learning our voices and our fears, made my skin crawl. I'd thought the ocean was just water and fish and weather, dangerous in the way that all wild places were dangerous. I hadn't considered that it might be home to something intelligent, something that could think and plan and deceive. Why doesn't Harold just tell people the truth? Instead of calling them rules, why not explain what we're really dealing with? Charlie shrugged. "Would you have believed him? If he'd told you on your first day that there were monsters in the water that could imitate your family's voices, would you have taken the job?" He had a point. Even now, having experienced it myself, part of my mind was still trying to find rational explanations. Maybe Sarah really had somehow ended up on the boat. Maybe I'd been dreaming and hadn't realized it. Maybe the stress of the new job was making me hallucinate. But the evidence was too strong to ignore. I'd seen my face in the water, smiling when I wasn't smiling. I'd heard my sister's voice coming from an empty corridor. And Charlie's reaction, the fear in his eyes, the way he'd grabbed me, proved that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. The rules weren't superstition. They were survival instructions, written in the blood of crew members, who'd learned too late that the ocean held more than fish and storms. I lay back on my bunk and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the boat cutting through the water. Every creak and groan seemed more ominous now. Every footstep in the corridor outside made me tense up. The ocean that had seemed like just another workplace a few days ago now felt like enemy territory, full of things that wanted to drag me down into the dark. But I was still here, still breathing, still alive, still learning how to survive in a world where the rules mean everything, and breaking them means disappearing forever. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. But every time I started to drift off, I heard Sarah's voice echoing in my memory, pleading for help that I couldn't give her. The voice that hadn't been Sarah at all, but something else wearing her words like a mask, something that knew exactly how to hurt me and would be waiting for its next chance to try. Sleep had been impossible after what happened at our cabin door. Every sound in the corridor made me tense up, waiting for another round of knocking that never came. Charlie had dozed fitfully in his bunk, but I could tell he was listening too, ready to grab me if I tried to do something stupid again. When morning finally arrived, we both pretended we'd gotten rest and went about our work like nothing had happened. The day passed normally enough, hauling nets, sorting fish, learning more of the boat's rhythms, but I found myself studying the other crew members differently now, wondering what voices had tried to lure them out into the dark. Nobody talked about it, just like nobody had made a big deal about my face in the water that first night. It was becoming clear that these things happened regularly on the Mercy's call, and the crew's survival depended on keeping quiet and following Harold's rules. By evening, the weather had started to turn. I could feel it in the way the boat moved, the swells getting bigger and coming from different directions. The horizon had taken on a gray-green color that made my stomach uneasy, and the wind carried a weight to it that felt like pressure against my skin. I was helping Charlie secure some loose equipment when the radio crackled to life in the wheelhouse. Harold's voice came over the intercom, calling all hands to stations. Something in his tone made everyone move faster than usual. "Distress call," he announced as we gathered in the galley. "Fishing vessel Jenny Lee, about 8 miles northeast of our position. Engine failure, and they're reporting a storm moving in fast." Through the windows, I could see the weather getting worse by the minute. The waves were already high enough to send spray across our deck, and the wind was picking up to the point where you had to raise your voice to be heard outside. "Captain," one of the older crew members said, "those conditions are only going to get worse. Maybe we should radio the Coast Guard instead." Harold shook his head. "They're too far out for the Guard to reach in time. We're the only vessel close enough to help." I watched the exchange with growing unease. Everything about this felt wrong. The timing, the weather, the way Harold seemed determined to push through conditions that had the rest of the crew looking nervous. But he was the captain, and if there were people in trouble out there, we couldn't just leave them to die. Harold changed course toward the distress coordinates, and I felt the boat's motion change as we started fighting the storm instead of riding with it. The engine strained against waves that seemed to grow larger with each passing minute, and soon everything that wasn't tied down was sliding back and forth across the deck. "Mitchell," Harold called from the wheelhouse, "I need you on the spotlight. We're going to need all the visibility we can get." I made my way to the spotlight controls, gripping handholds to keep from being thrown around as the boat pitched and rolled. The storm had arrived with a violence that made our previous days of fishing seem like a pleasure cruise. Rain lashed across the deck in sheets, and the waves were tall enough that I lost sight of the horizon when we dropped into the troughs between swells. Working the spotlight in these conditions was like trying to paint with a brush attached to a jackhammer. Every time I got the beam pointed where I wanted it, the boat would lurch and send the light spinning across empty water or storm clouds. But gradually I started to get the hang of it, anticipating the boat's movements and keeping the beam more or less stable. "There!" Harold shouted over the storm noise. 2 points off the starboard bow." I swung the spotlight in that direction and caught a glimpse of something dark against the churning water. At first it was just a shadow, disappearing and reappearing as the waves rolled between us. But as we got closer, The shape resolved into the outline of another fishing vessel. The Jenny Lee looked intact from what I could see through the storm. Her hull rode the swells like she was built for them, and I could make out the familiar silhouette of nets and winches on her deck. But something felt wrong about the scene, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "Where's her crew?" Charlie asked from beside me. That's when I realized what had been bothering me. The boat was riding the storm perfectly, but there was no one visible on deck. No crew members securing equipment or managing the vessel. No lights in the wheelhouse windows. The Jenny Lee looked like a ghost ship, sailing herself through the storm. Then I saw movement. A figure appeared on the other boat's deck, waving frantically in our direction. I focused the spotlight beam on the figure and felt my breath catch. It was a woman in a white dress, standing near the stern railing with both arms raised above her head. "Help us!" Her voice carried clearly across the water, somehow audible over the wind and waves. "Please, our engine's dead and the crew is hurt." Harold pushed our boat closer, fighting the storm to bring us within shouting distance of the Jenny Lee. The woman kept waving, her movements urgent and desperate. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair that whipped around her face in the wind. But as I kept the spotlight trained on her, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. Her white dress was completely dry. The rain was coming down in torrents and waves were crashing over the Jenny Lee's deck every few seconds, but the woman's clothing showed no signs of getting wet. The fabric didn't cling to her body the way soaked cloth should, and it moved in the wind like it was made of something lighter than cotton or linen. "Come closer," she called out. "The men below deck are badly injured. I don't know how to help them." Harold steered us nearer, and I could see his face in the wheelhouse lights. He looked transfixed, like he was watching something beautiful instead of a desperate rescue situation. His usual caution had been replaced by an expression I'd never seen before. A kind of dreamy concentration that reminded me of how I'd felt when I looked down into the water that first night. "Please," the woman cried. "I'm so scared. I don't know what to do." I trained the spotlight directly on her face, and she looked up into the beam with eyes that seemed to glow in the harsh light. When she saw me watching her, she smiled. It was a beautiful smile, the kind that could make you forget everything else in the world. But it was wrong in the same way that my reflection in the water had been wrong. Too wide, too knowing, like she was sharing a joke that only she understood. Her lips moved, and though I couldn't hear her words over the storm, I had the strange certainty that she was speaking directly to me. The smile never wavered, as her mouth formed shapes that might have been my name. Harold brought us closer still, close enough that I could make out individual features on the woman's face. She was stunning in a way that seemed almost artificial, like someone had taken the idea of feminine beauty and refined it until it became something more than human. "Captain," Charlie said urgently, "something's not right about this." But Harold didn't seem to hear him. He was leaning forward in the wheelhouse, his hands loose on the wheel, completely focused on the woman in white. We were drifting closer to the Jenny Lee with each wave, close enough now that I could see the other boat's deck details clearly. That's when I noticed that the woman wasn't leaving footprints on the wet deck. Despite the constant spray and rain, the metal surface around her feet showed no sign that anyone was standing there. The woman's smile grew wider as she watched me realize this. She raised one hand and pointed directly at me, her finger steady despite the pitching of both boats. Her mouth moved again, and this time I was sure she was saying my name. "Harold!" I shouted. "Something's wrong with her." The woman's beautiful face changed. For just a moment, her features shifted into something else, something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. Then the illusion snapped back into place, leaving me wondering if I'd seen anything at all. "Everyone hold on!" Harold's voice cracked like a whip across the deck. The engine roared to life at full power, and our boat lurched away from the Jenny Lee so violently that I had to grab the spotlight housing to keep from being thrown overboard. The woman in white was still standing on the other boat's deck, still smiling, still pointing in my direction as the distance between us grew. But now her voice had changed. Instead of desperate pleas for help, I heard something that made my skin crawl, a sound like laughter mixed with the cry of seabirds, rising above the storm winds and carrying across the water with unnatural clarity. Harold pushed the engine to its limit, navigating through the massive waves with a desperate urgency that told me we were running from something far more dangerous than bad weather. The engine's roar drowned out almost everything else as Harold pushed our boat away from the Jenny Lee, but the woman's voice still cut through the noise like a knife through paper. I kept the spotlight beam trained on her, watching her expression shift from desperate pleading to something that made my hands shake around the light's controls. Her beautiful face twisted into a mask of pure rage. The perfect features I'd been staring at moments before stretched and contorted, her mouth opening wider than any human mouth should. The scream that came out wasn't words anymore. It was something primal and furious, like the sound a wild animal makes when its prey escapes. "Hold on!" Harold shouted from the wheelhouse. Our boat pitched violently as we crashed through a massive wave. I wrapped one arm around the spotlight housing and used the other to keep the beam steady, though keeping my footing felt impossible with the deck rolling beneath me. The woman on the Jenny Lee's deck hadn't moved from her position near the stern railing, but her white dress was behaving in ways that defied the storm around her. Instead of being whipped by the wind like it should have been, the fabric billowed and flowed in directions that made no sense, sometimes seeming to float upward against gravity itself. She raised both arms above her head and let out another shriek, this one so loud and piercing that it somehow reached us over the engine noise and crashing waves. The sound wasn't just angry, it was hungry, like something that had been denied a meal it had been counting on. The words she screamed weren't in any language I recognized. They had a rhythm to them, almost like she was chanting or casting some kind of spell. But the syllables were harsh and guttural. Nothing like the sweet voice that had been calling for help minutes earlier. Each word seemed to carry across the water with unnatural clarity, as if the storm itself was helping to amplify her voice. Harold spun the wheel hard to starboard, sending us into a turn so sharp that I thought we might capsize. The spotlight beam swung wildly across the water before I managed to get it back under control. When I found the Jenny Lee again, the woman was still there, still screaming her alien words. But now she was pointing directly at our boat with both hands. Her face had changed completely. What I'd thought was beautiful before now looked like something wearing beauty as a disguise. Her eyes reflected the spotlight beam like an animal's, glowing with a light that seemed to come from inside her skull. Her smile had become something with too many teeth, each one sharp and white as bone. Charlie appeared beside me, gripping the railing with both hands as our boat fought through another massive wave. He had to shout to be heard over the storm and engine. "She's not moving with the boat." He was right. The Jenny Lee was pitching and rolling in the storm just like any vessel should, but the woman remained perfectly upright and still, as if she was immune to the laws of physics that governed everything else around her. Her feet never shifted position on the deck, never adjusted for balance, never slipped on the wet metal surface. I watched her raise one hand to her mouth and make a gesture like she was blowing a kiss in our direction. But instead of the innocent motion it should have been, something dark and oily seemed to stream from her lips toward us. The substance moved through the air faster than the wind could carry it, stretching across the distance between the boats like a living shadow. Harold must have seen it too, because he pushed the engine even harder. Our boat's hull slammed into the next wave with enough force to rattle my teeth, but we were pulling away from the Jenny Lee and whatever the woman was trying to send after us. The dark stream fell short, hitting the water between our boats and disappearing into the churning sea. The woman's shriek of frustration was so loud that I felt it in my chest like a physical blow. She stamped her foot on the deck in rage, and I swear I saw the metal beneath her bend and buckle, though that might have been a trick of the spotlight beam. We were far enough away now that her voice was starting to fade beneath the storm noise, but I could still make out the alien words she was screaming. They had a cadence that reminded me of a curse, each syllable spat out with venom and hatred. She kept pointing at us, kept gesturing like she was trying to pull our boat back through sheer force of will. Harold maintained our course and speed until the Jenny Lee disappeared completely into the storm. Only then did he throttle back the engine and allow our boat to settle into a more manageable rhythm with the waves. My arms ached from holding onto the spotlight controls, and my whole body felt like it had been shaken apart and reassembled. "Cut the light!" Harold called out. I switched off the spotlight, plunging us back into the storm's natural darkness. After staring into that bright beam for so long, everything around me seemed black as ink. I could hear the crew moving around on deck, checking equipment and making sure nothing had been lost during our desperate escape. Harold emerged from the wheelhouse and made his way across the wet deck to where Charlie and I were standing. His face looked 10 years older than it had an hour ago, and his hands were trembling slightly as he gripped the railing. "Everyone below," he said. "We need to wait out the rest of the storm." The galley felt warm and bright after the chaos on deck. Harold poured coffee for everyone, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man coming down from a massive adrenaline rush. The other crew members settled around the table without much conversation, all of us processing what we'd just witnessed. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug and waited for someone to explain what had happened. The woman's transformation kept playing in my mind, the way her beautiful face had twisted into something predatory, the inhuman sounds she'd made, the impossible behavior of her dress in the wind. Harold took a long sip of his coffee before speaking. "That was a siren," he said simply. The word hung in the air like smoke. I'd heard sirens mentioned in old stories and mythology, but I'd always thought they were just legends, fairy tales to explain why ships sometimes disappeared at sea. "Real sirens," Harold continued, "don't look like the mermaids in picture books. They look like whatever you want them to look like, whatever will make you want to get closer. Beautiful women usually, but sometimes they'll appear as men if that's what works better on a particular crew." I thought about how stunning the woman had been, how even in the middle of a storm, I'd been captivated by her appearance. The way Harold had leaned forward in the wheelhouse, completely focused on her face. "They appear during storms," Harold said, "when visibility is poor and rescue situations are believable. They'll take over empty vessels or create the illusion of ships in distress, then call for help in voices that sound completely human." "The Jenny Lee," Charlie said. "Was that a real boat?" Harold nodded grimly. "Real boat, real crew, probably taken 3 or 4 days ago. The siren was using it as bait, keeping it floating and seaworthy to make the distress call seem legitimate." I felt sick thinking about the actual crew of the Jenny Lee, whatever had happened to them before the siren took over their vessel. Men like us, probably, just trying to make a living from the sea. "How did you know?" I asked. "How did you realize what she was?" "Experience," Harold said. "And luck. I've seen it before, though not many who encounter sirens live to tell about it. There are always signs if you know what to look for." He ticked off points on his fingers as he spoke. "Real distress calls don't come from women alone on deck during storms. Real people get wet in the rain. Real people move with the motion of their boat. And real people don't have voices that carry perfectly across open water in hurricane-force winds." I thought about the woman's dry dress, the way she'd stood motionless on the pitching deck, how clearly her voice had reached us over the storm noise. "The pointing," Charlie added. "The way she kept pointing at us. People in real distress don't do that. They wave, they jump up and down, they try to signal with whatever they have. They don't stand still and point like they're choosing a target." Harold nodded approvingly. "Charlie's been paying attention. The pointing is always a bad sign. It means they've decided which one of us they want most. I remembered the woman's finger aimed directly at me, steady and unwavering despite the storm. The way her mouth had seemed to form my name even when she was supposedly calling for help. "Why me?" I asked. "You were operating the spotlight," Harold said. "You were the one looking at her most directly, giving her the clearest connection to work with. Sirens need eye contact to establish their influence. The longer you look at them, the stronger their hold becomes." That explained Harold's behavior in the wheelhouse, the dreamy expression on his face as he'd steered us closer to the Jenny Lee. Even with all his experience, he'd been falling under the siren's spell. What would have happened if we'd gotten closer? Harold's expression darkened. They would have lured us alongside their vessel, then boarded our boat. The crew would have been taken care of. The siren would have used our ship to hunt other vessels, the way she was using the Jenny Lee. The casual way he said "taken care of" made it clear that he wasn't talking about anything as merciful as a quick death. I thought about the alien words the woman had screamed at us, the hungry sound in her voice, the way her eyes had glowed in the spotlight beam. "The Coast Guard will find the Jenny Lee tomorrow morning," Harold continued, "adrift and empty, with no sign of the crew or the woman. It happens more often than people realize, but the official reports always list the cause as weather-related incident or crew lost at sea. Nobody wants to put siren attack in a government document." I stared into my coffee, trying to process everything I'd learned. First the face in the water, then the voice at our cabin door. Now a creature that could perfectly mimic human appearance and voice to lure ships to their destruction. The ocean was turning out to be far more dangerous than I'd ever imagined, filled with things that saw humans as nothing more than prey. "How many other things are out there?" I asked. Harold met my eyes across the table. "More than you want to know about. But now you understand why the rules exist. Every regulation I gave you on your first day was written in blood, learned by crews who didn't make it back to port." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the galley I felt a different kind of chill. We'd escaped tonight, but only barely, and only because Harold had recognized the danger in time. Next time, we might not be so lucky. I thought about the woman's final scream of rage as we'd pulled away, the way she'd tried to send that dark stream after our boat. She'd been so close to succeeding, so close to adding us to whatever collection of vanished crews she already possessed. The coffee tasted bitter in my mouth, but I kept drinking it anyway, grateful for its warmth and the simple human comfort of sitting around a table with other survivors. Outside, the storm slowly began to weaken, but I knew the ocean's supernatural dangers would remain, patient and hungry, waiting for the next crew foolish enough to answer their calls for help. The woman in white was still out there somewhere, still beautiful, still deadly, still hunting for ships that would come close enough for her to claim, but she wouldn't find us again. We'd learned her tricks, seen through her disguise, and lived to tell about it. At least for tonight, that had to be enough. I woke to the sound of my name drifting through the metal walls like smoke through a keyhole. "Thomas! Thomas, can you hear me?" The voice was muffled and distant, coming from somewhere inside the ship's ventilation system rather than outside our cabin door. It carried the hollow echo that air ducts gave to sound, but underneath that metallic distortion, I recognized Charlie's voice immediately. 3 nights had passed since our encounter with the siren, and the memory still felt raw in my mind. We'd fallen back into our normal routine. Fishing during the day, card games in the evening, uneasy sleep in our cramped quarters. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that woman's beautiful face twisting into something predatory, heard her inhuman shrieks cutting through the storm. Now, another storm was battering the Mercy's call, rain drumming against the hull while the boat rocked through swells that made everything not tied down slide back and forth across the deck. The engine's steady rumble mixed with the wind howling outside, creating the kind of background noise that could mask almost any other sound. except for Charlie's voice calling my name through the vents. Thomas, I need help. I'm trapped somewhere and I can't get out. I lay in my bunk, staring up at the metal ceiling where the ventilation grate was mounted. The voice seemed to be coming from directly above my head, though that didn't make sense. The duct system ran throughout the ship, connecting every room and compartment. Charlie could be calling from anywhere, but Charlie should be in the bunk 3 feet away from me. I rolled over and looked across the narrow space between our beds. Charlie's blanket was thrown back, his pillow still indented from his head, but the bunk was empty. His boots were gone from where he usually left them on the floor, and his rain jacket wasn't hanging on the hook by the door. Thomas, please. I don't know where I am. Everything looks the same and I can't find my way back. The voice carried that note of panic I'd heard from Charlie only once before. The night something had pretended to be my sister Sarah, knocking at our door. But this was different. Instead of terror, Charlie sounded confused and disoriented, like someone who'd gotten lost in a place that should have been familiar. I sat up in my bunk, the metal frame creaking under my weight. Harold's rules echoed in my head. Don't go on deck alone at night. Don't open your door unless you know who's knocking. Don't look overboard unless it's part of your duties. Nothing about voices in the ventilation system, but the principle was the same. If something felt wrong, it probably was. Still, this was Charlie, my bunkmate, the guy who'd saved me from opening our door to whatever had been impersonating Sarah. The crew member who'd taught me knots and fish sorting without making me feel stupid about my inexperience. Thomas, I'm hurt. I think I'm bleeding. Can you find me? I'm somewhere near the engine room, I think, but all the corridors look the same. The desperate edge in his voice made my chest tight. Charlie knew this boat better than I did. He'd been working on fishing vessels for years, could navigate the Mercy's call in complete darkness. If he was lost and confused, something had happened to him. I swung my legs over the side of my bunk and reached for my boots. The deck felt cold against my bare feet, and I could feel the boat's motion more acutely standing up. We were taking bigger waves than I'd realized, the hull shuddering with each impact. Please, Thomas. I can hear machinery running, but I can't figure out how to get back to the cabin area. There's water dripping somewhere, and I think it might be blood. I paused with one boot half on, listening to the pain in Charlie's voice. The sound was definitely coming through the ventilation grate above my bunk, echoing through the ductwork with that hollow, metallic quality. But something about it bothered me, though I couldn't pin down exactly what. Maybe it was too clear. Even accounting for the echo, Charlie's words were reaching me with perfect clarity, every syllable distinct and understandable. In my limited experience with ship ventilation systems, voices usually got distorted beyond recognition when they traveled through metal ducts. Or maybe it was the background noise. Charlie claimed to be near the engine room, but I couldn't hear any of the mechanical sounds that should have been present in that part of the ship. No pumps cycling, no electrical hum, no vibration from the main engine that powered our propeller. I finished putting on my boots and stood up, the boat's motion making me grab the wall for balance. The voice in the vents had gone quiet, leaving only the storm sounds and the engine's rumble. But now I was fully awake and thinking more clearly. Other details started to bother me. Charlie's boots were gone, but his socks were still on the floor next to his bunk. His rain jacket was missing, but his regular work jacket hung on its usual hook. If he'd gotten dressed to go somewhere, why would he take the rain gear but leave the everyday jacket behind? And when had he left? I was a light sleeper, had been ever since that first night when I'd heard my reflection speaking from the water. The sound of Charlie moving around the cabin should have woken me up, especially with the boat pitching the way it was. Thomas, the water's getting deeper. I think there might be a leak down here. I can't swim very well, you know that. The voice came back, more urgent now, with an edge of fear that made my hands shake as I reached for the door handle. Charlie had never mentioned not being able to swim. In fact, I was pretty sure all crew members on fishing vessels were required to pass basic water safety tests. But the desperation in his voice was so convincing, so perfectly like Charlie when he was scared. My hand was already turning the door handle before I caught myself. Harold's rules. Don't go on deck alone at night. Technically, Charlie wasn't asking me to go on deck. He was asking me to search the interior of the ship. But the spirit of the rule was clear. Don't wander around alone when supernatural things were active. Stay in your cabin unless there was a genuine emergency. Was this a genuine emergency? Thomas, please, I can hear you moving around up there. I know you're awake. Why won't you help me? The voice had changed slightly, taking on a wounded tone that made me feel like the worst kind of friend. Charlie had protected me from making deadly mistakes twice already. If he needed help now, how could I ignore him? I opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was dimly lit by emergency lighting, casting long shadows that moved and shifted with the boat's motion. I could hear snoring from some of the other cabins, but most of the crew seemed to be sleeping through the storm. The galley was my first stop. If Charlie was really lost somewhere in the ship, maybe some of the other crew members were already looking for him. The coffee pot was still warm, and several mugs sat on the table, suggesting that someone had been up recently. I found 4 crew members in the galley, playing cards and drinking coffee. They looked up when I entered, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. "Seen Charlie?" I asked. The older crew member I'd met on my first day shook his head. "Not since dinner." "Why?" "He's not in our cabin. I heard him calling for help through the vents, said he was lost somewhere near the engine room." The card players exchanged glances, and I caught the same look I'd seen after my encounter with the face in the water. Not disbelief, but recognition. Like they'd heard similar stories before. "How long has he been missing?" another crew member asked. "I don't know. I just woke up to his voice in the ventilation system. His bunk was empty." One of the men stood up and walked to the galley window, looking out at the storm-lashed deck. "Visibility's terrible out there. If he went outside for some reason." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. In weather like this, going on deck alone would be suicide even without supernatural threats. "Thomas, I'm running out of time. The water's up to my chest now. Please, you have to find me." Charlie's voice echoed through the galley's ventilation grate, causing all 5 of us to look up at the ceiling. The desperation in his tone was heartbreaking, and I felt my resolve to follow Harold's rules starting to crumble. "I have to go look for him," I said, starting toward the door. Harold stepped into the galley, blocking my path. His expression was grim, and his rain jacket was soaked through, water still dripping from the hood and sleeves. He looked like he'd been outside in the storm, and his face carried the kind of exhaustion that came from searching for something you knew you wouldn't find. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "Charlie's in trouble. He's trapped somewhere, and Charlie went outside 20 minutes ago." Harold cut me off. "I heard the same voice you're hearing now, calling for help through the vents. Charlie believed it was real. He broke the first rule and went on deck alone." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at Harold's dripping rain jacket, at the grim set of his mouth, and felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "Where is he?" Harold's expression darkened. I went out to bring him back as soon as I realized what had happened. Found his raincoat hanging on the stern railing, still dripping with seawater. The rain stopped 10 minutes before I got there. "Thomas, why aren't you looking for me? I thought we were friends. I thought you cared about what happened to me." Charlie's voice continued calling through the vents, but now it sounded different to my ears. The words were still perfect, still conveying exactly the right emotion to make me want to help. But there was something underneath the familiar tone, something hungry and patient, that reminded me of the siren's beautiful smile. Harold moved closer, his eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made me take a step back. "You should have stopped him," Harold said, his voice low and angry. Crew members are supposed to watch out for each other. You were his bunkmate. You should have known he was being lured away." The accusation hit harder than any physical blow. Charlie had saved me twice from supernatural threats, and when something had come for him, I'd been asleep in my bunk, useless and unaware. My friend was gone, taken by the same ocean that had been hunting us since we'd left port. "I didn't know," I said weakly. "You should have known," Harold repeated. "That's how survival works out here. We keep each other alive by paying attention, by recognizing when something's wrong." Charlie understood that. He protected you from making fatal mistakes, and you failed to return the favor. "Thomas, please. The water's over my head now. I can't breathe. Help me." The voice in the vents was starting to sound less like Charlie and more like something else wearing his voice as a disguise. The words were becoming distorted, taking on that same alien quality I'd heard from the siren during the storm. But it was too late for recognition to matter. Charlie was gone, claimed by whatever supernatural force had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to strike. And according to Harold, his death was partly my fault for failing to protect the person who had protected me. I sank into one of the galley chairs, the weight of guilt settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but the real damage had already been done. The ocean had taken another crew member, and I had to live with the knowledge that I could have prevented it. The voice in the vents called my name one more time, then went silent, leaving only the sound of rain against the hull and the accusatory silence of the crew around me. Sleep never came after Harold's words settled into my bones like lead shot. I sat in that galley chair for hours, listening to the storm weaken outside while the crew gradually dispersed to their bunks. Harold remained at the table across from me, drinking coffee and watching the rain streak down the windows. Neither of us spoke. There wasn't much left to say. When gray light finally crept through the portholes, Harold stood and pulled on his still damp rain jacket. The storm had blown itself out during the night, leaving behind the kind of exhausted calm that followed severe weather. The boat's motion had settled into gentle swells, and the wind no longer howled through the rigging. "Come on," Harold said. "We're going to search this boat from stem to stern." I followed him out of the galley, my legs stiff from sitting in the same position for so long. The corridors felt different in the morning light, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved closer together during the night. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Every corner seemed to hold the possibility of finding Charlie crammed into some impossible space. We started in the engine room, working our way through the maze of pipes and machinery that kept the Mercy's call running. Harold moved methodically, checking behind equipment housings and inside maintenance compartments that I wouldn't have thought to examine. His flashlight beam swept across every surface, looking for any sign that Charlie had been down here. The engine room was exactly what it should have been. Hot, noisy, and smelling of diesel fuel and metal lubricants. No trace of the flooding that the voice in the vents had described. No blood on the deck plates. No indication that anyone had been trapped down here in rising water. From there, we moved to the storage compartments, then the fish holds, then every bathroom and closet and utility space on the boat. Harold opened every hatch, moved every piece of equipment that could be shifted, examined every corner where a grown man might hide or be hidden. I helped where I could, but mostly I just followed and watched, learning how thoroughly a search needed to be conducted when someone's life might depend on finding them. We found nothing. After 3 hours of looking, we had covered every accessible space on the Mercy's call without discovering so much as a thread from Charlie's clothing. It was like he had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only that wet raincoat hanging on the stern railing. But the raincoat bothered me more now than it had the night before. Harold had found it after the rain stopped, but the fabric had been soaked through with seawater, not fresh water from the storm. Charlie's coat had been dipped in the ocean, wrung out, and then carefully placed on the railing like a calling card. Whatever had taken Charlie wanted us to know it had him. Harold called all hands to the galley at 10 o'clock. The remaining crew members filed in looking tired and worried, settling around the table with their coffee mugs, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing something terrible has happened but not understanding the details. I took my usual seat and watched Harold pour himself a fresh cup of coffee. His hands were steady, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held his jaw just a little too tight. Charlie's disappearance had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. "Charlie Brooks is gone," Harold announced without preamble. "He went on deck alone last night during the storm and didn't come back. We've searched the entire boat and found no trace of him except his raincoat." The crew absorbed this information in silence. A few of them nodded like they'd already figured out what had happened. Others stared into their coffee, processing the reality that they were now one man short with weeks of fishing still ahead of them. "This happened because someone broke the first rule," Harold continued. "Don't go on deck alone at night. Charlie knew better, but he went anyway because he thought he heard someone calling for help." Harold's eyes found mine across the table, and I felt the weight of his accusation all over again. I should have stopped Charlie somehow, should have been awake when he left the cabin, should have recognized the danger before it was too late. "The rules aren't suggestions," Harold said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen too many good men lost to the ocean's predators. "They're not superstitions or old wives' tales. They're the difference between making it home to your families and becoming another missing persons report filed with the Coast Guard." He held up one finger. "First rule, never go on deck alone at night. If you hear an emergency, wake someone else first. If you think someone needs help, get back up before you investigate. There is nothing on this boat that's more important than your life, and there's nothing in the ocean that won't use your desire to help others against you." A second finger joined the first. "Second rule, if someone knocks on your cabin door, ask who it is through the door. If they don't answer, or if their answer feels wrong in any way, don't open that door. The things that hunt us are good at mimicking voices, but they're not perfect. Trust your instincts." The third finger completed the count. "Final rule, don't look overboard unless it's part of your assigned duties and you have someone else with you. The ocean will show you things that aren't real, and once you start looking, it becomes harder to stop." Harold lowered his hand and took a sip of his coffee. Charlie knew all 3 rules. He'd been working boats for 4 years and had never broken any of them before. But last night, something convinced him that the rules didn't apply to his particular situation. I thought about the voice in the vents, the perfect imitation of Charlie's panic and desperation. Whatever had spoken through the ventilation system had known exactly which emotional buttons to push, had crafted its plea for help with surgical precision. But now that I had time to think about it clearly, I realized the voice hadn't just been imitating Charlie. It had been imitating me calling Charlie's name. The creature had used my voice to lure Charlie outside, probably starting the process while I was still asleep and unaware. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Charlie hadn't just been targeted randomly. He'd been specifically hunted using me as bait. Whatever was in the ocean had studied us long enough to understand our relationship, had learned that Charlie would risk his life to help me if he thought I was in danger. My friend had died trying to save me from a threat that didn't exist, manipulated into breaking the rules by something that understood human nature better than most humans did. "Mitchell," Harold said, and I looked up to find everyone at the table staring at me. "You're on night watch duty starting tonight. Experienced crew members need to keep an eye on the newer ones, make sure they don't make the same mistakes Charlie did." I nodded, not trusting my voice enough to speak. Harold was giving me a chance to redeem myself, to protect other crew members the way I'd failed to protect Charlie. But the assignment also felt like a punishment, a reminder that I bore some responsibility for what had happened. The meeting broke up after Harold assigned new work details to account for being one man short. The other crew members dispersed to their tasks, leaving me alone in the galley with my guilt and the growing understanding of how much I still didn't know about survival on the deep ocean. That evening, as the sun disappeared into the western horizon, I took up my position for the first night watch. Harold had given me a small notebook to record anything unusual, along with strict instructions to wake him immediately if anything seemed wrong. The watch position was in the wheelhouse, where I could monitor the radio and keep an eye on both the deck and the surrounding ocean. The boat moved gently through calm seas, the engine maintaining a steady rhythm that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. I settled into the watch chair and opened the notebook to the first page. The previous entries went back months, recording everything from equipment malfunctions to weather observations to brief notations that simply said, "Heard voices, ignored per protocol." At 11:30, the first knock came. 3 sharp raps on the galley door, clearly audible through the wheelhouse speakers that carried sound from all parts of the boat. I looked out the wheelhouse window and confirmed that the deck was empty, then made a note in the logbook. 23:30, knocking at galley door, no one on deck. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Then a voice started calling through the galley vents, muffled but clearly recognizable as one of the crew members who was currently asleep in his bunk. "Hello? Is anyone there? I'm trapped in the fish hold and the hatch is jammed shut." I wrote down the details and checked my watch. The voice continued for about 5 minutes, growing more desperate and panicked, before finally going silent. 15 minutes later, knocking started at a different door, followed by a different voice claiming to be lost in the engine room. This pattern continued throughout the night. Every hour or so, phantom knocks would echo through the boat, followed by perfectly imitated voices calling for help from impossible locations. I heard crew members claiming to be trapped in spaces I knew were empty, injured in compartments they had no reason to visit, or lost in areas they'd navigated successfully for years. Each voice was flawless. The accent, the vocabulary, the emotional inflection. Everything was exactly right. If I hadn't known the actual crew members were safely asleep in their bunks, I would have believed every single plea for help. But I didn't move from my position. I documented each incident in the logbook, noted the time and location of every suspicious sound, and kept my eyes fixed on the deck and ocean around us. The rules weren't suggestions, Harold had said, and Charlie's disappearance had proven that beyond any doubt. By morning, I had filled 4 pages with entries. Phantom knocks, disembodied voices, the sound of footsteps on empty deck areas, even what sounded like someone repeatedly opening and closing the hatch to the fish hold. The ocean's supernatural predators had been active all night, testing our defenses and looking for any crew member foolish enough to break the rules. None of us had taken the bait. As I handed the logbook over to Harold and prepared to get some sleep before the day shift started, I thought about the next new crew member who would eventually join the Mercy's call. Some kid like me, desperate for work and completely ignorant about the real dangers of deep-sea fishing. I would tell them about Charlie, about the face in the water that smiled when you weren't smiling back, about the voices that knew your sister's name, and exactly how she sounded when she was scared, about the woman in white who could appear beautiful and desperate right up until the moment her face revealed too many teeth. Maybe my warnings would save someone's life. Maybe sharing Charlie's story would prevent another crew member from making the same fatal mistake of thinking the rules didn't apply to their particular situation. The ocean was patient and cunning, always hunting for new prey, always learning better ways to exploit human weaknesses. But we could learn too. We could pass down the knowledge that kept people alive, build our defenses one story at a time. The deep sea would continue its relentless hunt, sending its creatures to test our resolve night after night. But now I understood that survival came down to one simple principle: follow the rules without exception, no matter how convincing the alternative might seem.